Go to save Tony Blair from further embarrassment.
I am guilty of a mistake, and I am paying the price for it, and I make no bones about saying that is my fault.
How damaged is the Prime Minister by the resignation? The opposition accuse him of losing his authority.
For how long will this country have to put up with this lame duck Prime Minister in office but not in power?
And a huge rebellion by Labour MPs threatens the government's anti-terrorism plans.
Also tonight, a mother walks free after admitting she killed the Down syndrome son she cared for over 30 years.
A sixth night of violence in Paris, the French president appeals for calm.
And lunch at the White House. Charles and Camilla meet George and the First Lady.
Tonight on BBC London News, police may be drafted in to protect doctors' surgeries if a flu pandemic hits here. And a vicar's fighting for his life after being stabbed as he visited parishioners.
Good evening, welcome to the 6 o'clock news.
First tonight, I'm guilty of a mistake and I'm paying the price. For the second time in his political career, David Blunkett has been forced to resign. Stepping down as Work and Pension Secretary, he said to protect the government from the controversy over his business dealings. Tony Blair said he had accepted the resignation reluctantly. Well, our political editor, Nick Robinson, is at the House of Commons. Nick, it's been a dramatic day.
A dramatic day, Natasha, yes, for journalists. A disastrous day for David Blunkett. A day that Tony Blair must wish heartily that he could forget. If we weren't talking about David Blunkett, we would be talking about the smallest parliamentary majority Mr. Blair has ever had. And we will be in just a second. But first, the extraordinary story of the fight to keep a cabinet minister, which ended with him walking out of the door today.
You get your shots.
Political death is a horribly public affair. David Blunkett knows it. He's been through all this before. This time, there will be no coming back. This was the day his defiance died. The day he finally admitted to making mistakes. The day he conceded he'd have to go.
So I am guilty of a mistake, and I am paying the price for it, and I make no bones about saying that is my fault, and I stand by it.
He admitted, broken the ministerial code, but only out of confusion.
I stepped down today precisely to protect the government from diversion, from the policies that we're carrying out, from the reforms we're bringing in.
In truth, the Blunkett soap opera of one man and his dog, his lover and his wealthy friends, has never stopped being a diversion.
Unless we understand that the private and the public are separate, we will destroy our democracy in Britain.
It was David Blunkett's private life that started to destroy his public life a year ago, forcing him out of the cabinet for the first time as he fought his lover over who was the father of her son. That cost him tens of thousands of pounds. His efforts to earn that money back today lost him his job in the cabinet. When David Blunkett left home this morning, he'd already phoned the Prime Minister to talk about resigning.
You're an embarrassment to the Prime Minister, Mr. Blunkett.
His next stop was supposed to be an appearance before a committee of MPs at the House of Commons. When he failed to show, MPs and journalists began to sense that something was up.
David Blunkett was scheduled to appear before the Work and Pension Select Committee. Nick Robinson is on the phone, as I say. Nick, is he there?
No, and that is a fascinating fact. David Blunkett is not only not there, he is at 10 Downing Street, I'm told.
Minutes later, he left number 10, by the back door, of course. His resignation not yet official. By the time Tony Blair emerged from the front door, it was. He'd have to face Prime Minister's questions and explain why a man he defended had now gone.
Whatever mistakes my right honourable friend has made, I've always believed and believe now that he's a decent and honourable man who has contributed a great deal to his country, who has overcome immense challenges that frankly would have daunted the rest of us.
The Tory leader focused not on the departure of Mr. Blunkett, but on the consequences for Tony Blair.
We have seen the slow seepage of his authority turn into a hemorrhage.
Michael Howard knows that today's victim might be Mr. Blunkett, but tomorrow's could be Mr. Blair.
We all acknowledge the honourable way in which the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions has decided to resign, and I pay tribute to him for that. But the key question now is for the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister think that in his handling of this affair, his judgment has been at fault in any way?
My right honourable friend resigned for the reasons that he gave, that it became impossible for him, frankly, with the frenzy surrounding him and his job, for him to carry on doing that job properly. I think as he goes from government, we should say he goes, in my view, with no stain of impropriety against him whatever.
Ah, yes, but it's him the Tories are targeting now.
This week marks the beginning of the final chapter of his administration. For how long will this country have to put up with this lame duck Prime Minister in office but not in power?
Today at Westminster, David Blunkett cut a lonely figure. Tonight, Westminster wonders if he is not the only victim of this extraordinary day. David Blunkett has been one of the dominant figures of Labour politics in recent years. His life in recent months, though, has taken him dragged through the tabloids, through stage plays, through comedies too. Sean Leigh now looks back at the career of one of Labour's dominant figures.
David Blunkett, whether as family man, ambitious politician or senior cabinet minister, is normally at ease in the public eye. Whatever his troubles, and they've been many over the last 12 months, he's been able to count on Tony Blair's support, always at the Prime Minister's side. Tonight, no longer. Mr Blair wanted him back in cabinet, a reliable ally and a political soulmate, but it was a gamble. The Prime Minister wanted him to reduce the benefits bill and thought he was the man to sell it to restive Labour MPs.
And I'm proud of what I've done in the last 6 months in preparing the reform of the welfare state, the biggest, most comprehensive reform of the welfare state since the Second World War.
The young Blunkett grew up in poverty. The death of his father in an horrific industrial accident left his mother practically penniless. At the age of 4, the local council sent him to a boarding school for the blind.
This little lad couldn't cling on. He had to realise that he was now going to have to fend for himself.
He was bright and he was stubborn. By his early 30s, he was running the local council. Soon he was a national figure, a darling of the left who rallied the Labour conference.
Get off your ears, get back to the branches and constituencies of the trade unions and start the battle now to save this party and our local government system.
But eventually, the left-wing firebrand would evolve into one of the sharpest brains in New Labour. Tony Blair made him Education Secretary, and after successfully confronting the teaching unions, his reward was one of the top jobs. As Home Secretary, he offered strong support to the police, took a tough line on immigration and was impatient with lawyers and judges, sentiments he shared with Mr Blair, who thought the voters would approve. And then he met Kimberly Quinn. Their relationship produced a son, but ended in bitterness. His cabinet colleagues sympathised as he faced a succession of lurid newspaper stories, but support evaporated when his biographer revealed what he really thought of his fellow ministers. What proved fatal, though, were allegations that he'd used his influence to get a visa for Kimberly Quinn's nanny. He said he hadn't, but an official had written "no favours but slightly quicker" on the paperwork. Indirectly, the affair led to his downfall.
I misunderstood what we had. I misunderstood that someone could do this not just to me but to the little one as well, because there will be years to come. So the anguish of the weeks I've just had, and they have been the worst of my life.
Yet he was back at a Whitehall desk after just 6 months. Tony Blair must have hoped the only controversies would be political ones. Instead, Mr Blunkett was soon all over the tabloids again. Membership of an upmarket club, friendship with a younger woman, and the jobs he'd taken whilst out of government filled the papers. The editor of his local newspaper blames the legacy of the Quinn affair.
And I think, there may be some financial aspects of this where he was trying to retain an inheritance for his sons, which he'd had to spend on a court case. So the two are inextricably linked, really.
Tony Blair needs reliable allies in cabinet, so David Blunkett was given a second chance. Tonight, few expect him to get a third. Sean Leigh, BBC News, Westminster.
The loss of David Blunkett was clearly a terrible blow to the Prime Minister Tony Blair. But this afternoon came another, a backbench rebellion in a vote here in Parliament on proposed new terror laws that the Prime Minister says is vital to keep us all safe. The majority reduced to just one, the lowest ever, as our correspondent Margaret Gilmore now reports.
The ayes to the right, 299. The noes to the left, 300.
A very tight squeeze, the government scraping through by just one vote. This the lowest majority Labour has had in the Commons since coming to power 8 years ago. The rebellion brought on by its own backbenchers.
It is crazy if we land ourselves in a situation where we gag society.
Labour rebels joined Tory and Lib Dem critics who complained that government plans to outlaw the glorification of terrorism would criminalise the innocent.
A teacher or tutor distributing terrorist propaganda to a class studying history in the Middle East. Caught under the Act without a shadow of doubt. A broadcaster or newspaper.
And this wasn't even the most controversial part of the bill. That's being debated in the Commons now. A plan to hold terrorist suspects not for 14 days, but 3 months before charge. Why? Because the police want more time to gather evidence against the modern-day terrorist who uses complex computer codes and has associates worldwide. Opposition critics won't buy the idea and say the courts, not the police, should deal with suspects after 2 weeks, as happens now.
And if a charge can be brought, then thereafter the person is in the hands of the court system as the case proceeds to trial. These proposals, and I think the Home Secretary will acknowledge this, really drive a coach and horses through that principle.
Labour has never been defeated in the House over a mainstream bill. The Home Secretary has spent much of the day trying to bring rebels round. He's expected to tell the House in the next few minutes why he thinks 90 days is justified. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News, Westminster.
And this dramatic day is yet to end because MPs will vote again in the hours to come on that 90-day proposal from the Prime Minister. And the talk around here, no one can be sure, is that might not end in a small majority. It might end for defeat for the Prime Minister.
Nick, returning to the resignation of David Blunkett, why did he finally have to go today?
Quite simply because he had broken the rules, but he hadn't publicly apologised. He, in fact, tried to tough it out with a show of defiance, insisting he'd stay on, suggesting that his critics were only the Tories and parts of the media too, and that wasn't true. In the end, I think he felt, the Prime Minister felt, that this couldn't be allowed to go on. There was no obvious end in sight. Was there some other bit of information that we don't know, Natasha? We can't be sure. There may have been something that would push him over the edge. But the Blunkett soap opera, candidly, became too big for the government to bear.
Nick, and as you said, a very difficult day for the Prime Minister in general. How badly damaged is his authority?
Well, there's no doubt at all that the Prime Minister is damaged by fighting to keep on to someone who'd broken the rules and failing to keep on to that person. He defended Mr Blunkett's integrity today, even though Mr Blunkett had been criticised by 3 Westminster watchdogs, including, privately, his own Cabinet Secretary. Now he's moved to try and stem the damage, appointing a new Work and Pension Secretary. The little-known John Hutton moves from the Cabinet Office, little-known, and that's deliberate because he wants a quieter figure to pilot through controversial changes to incapacity benefit and to pensions too. If, and it is an if, he were defeated tonight, even if he's not and there's just a big backbench rebellion, there will be questions asked. He can't get his way in the Cabinet sometimes. He can't get his way sometimes in Parliament too. Is this the beginning, only the beginning of course, of the end of Tony Blair's authority?
Nick Robinson, thank you.
Well, Britain's pensions crisis is one of the most urgent problems that David Blunkett's successor must deal with. A new report says women may lose out because many aren't able to build up their entitlement to a state pension. Hugh Pym reports.
Enjoying family memories but worried about the future. Penny and Martin Grossman's daughters have grown up and it might have been time to take life easy. But because Penny took time away from work to bring up the children, she'd never built up a pension fund and she's concerned about that.
I can see myself having to work way past retirement age, probably well into my 80s I'll still be working, because I really don't see how else I will be able to live. Advisors have advised that we should save, but now the money that I would put away would absolutely give me virtually nothing.
At Westminster, pensions poverty is a big issue, and the figures explain why. 2.2 million women will not qualify for a basic state pension. 11.3 million men and women have no private pension savings, so will have to fall back on the state pension. It's estimated that £57 billion of extra savings is needed to ensure a decent standard of living in retirement for everyone. This expert argued 3 years ago in a report for the government that urgent action was required. He says Mr Blunkett's successor faces a big challenge.
It's central because it deals with both wealth creation and wealth distribution. It's not a one-dimensional challenge. One has to take account of education, finance, social policy. It's a job for a statesman, not a mere politician.
There could be problems for younger families. Joanne Cotter quit her job when her first child was born and has had to stop saving.
I am concerned about it, but we didn't really have much option because when I left with only one income coming in and 2 children to support, there's no money left for me to continue to put into my pension.
The options include compulsory pension saving for everyone and working longer. That's a lot for the new minister to think about. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
A mother who killed the Down syndrome son she'd cared for more than 30 years has been given a 2-year suspended jail sentence. Gwendolyn Markcrow smothered her son Patrick at her home in Buckinghamshire. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. June Kelly reports.
Gwendolyn Markcrow was described in court as a 100% devoted mother who snapped. Her son Patrick had Down syndrome and autism. He was constantly harming himself and would never sleep. She was his principal carer.
Wendy Markcrow has spent 36 years caring for Patrick. And during that time, she's never given a thought to herself. And she's won the admiration of everybody who knew her.
Giving her a suspended sentence, the judge, Mr Justice Gross, said, "You'll be punished as long as you live by what you have done and what you have lost." The pressures you faced were extraordinary. At the family home at Long Crendon in Buckinghamshire, Gwendolyn Markcrow gave her son tranquilizers and then suffocated him with a plastic bag. She attempted suicide. The court heard that she'd written to the local social services appealing for help. They say she turned down much of what they offered.
We had on offer for her respite care and daycare, which she did use in the past, but the reason she stopped using those services was because Patrick's behaviour when he returned to her was very, very challenging, very difficult. He was very distressed.
This was described in court as a highly unusual case. Nevertheless, it does raise the whole issue of the pressure on carers, particularly those with adult children who will always need somebody to look after them. Gwendolyn Markcrow must now try to pick up her life with the rest of her family. Her husband died earlier this year. June Kelly, BBC News at Oxford Crown Court.
Now it's approaching 6:20.
A reminder of tonight's top stories. David Blunkett has resigned from the Cabinet for the second time in a year. He says he had to go to save Tony Blair from further embarrassment. The government's majority has been slashed to just 1 in a backbench rebellion over new anti-terrorism laws.
And later in the programme, the royal visit to the United States. The American media give their less than flattering verdict on Camilla's sense of style.
Later on BBC London News.
The West End of London is the heartbeat of London and the heartbeat of the UK.
Peter Stringfellow tells us how to clean up the West End seedy image. And the man who saved Buckingham Palace from a German bomber, honoured today.
Now, imagine life without being able to watch television or use a computer. Well, that's the reality for thousands of people who claim that they have electromagnetic fields surrounding them every day. Now, they say those devices make them unwell. Tomorrow, government scientists will give their verdict, and the 6 o'clock news understands that they will say electrosensitivity, as it's called, doesn't really exist. For tonight's 6 special report, Denise Mahoney investigates the phenomenon.
I had to protect myself from the environment or move house because...
As soon as he gets home, Brian Steen turns all the electrics not on, but off.
And that allows me to sleep.